Welcome to today's webinar on the Wellbeing module produced by the Minnesota Department of Health. I'm Michaela Resch, a health educator and communication specialist with the Climate and Health Program at the Minnesota Department of Health. The Minnesota Climate and Health Program is part of a nationwide effort to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to the health impacts of climate change. The program follows 5 overarching goals that guide its work: educate and increase awareness of the health impacts of climate change, research and improve data for research to ensure that our work is based on the best science available, design and evaluate adaptation interventions, develop tools and products for public health practitioners and others to use to prepare for climate change, and provide technical assistance to communities for mapping vulnerable populations and planning for climate changes. This training module is one of 7 training modules that address the health effects of climate changes in Minnesota. The other 6 training modules cover the topics of Climate and Health 101, extreme heat events, agriculture and food security, water quality and quantity, air quality, and vector-borne disease. These modules have been designed for public health professionals as well as others concerned about climate change to provide a basic level of information about the observed climate changes in Minnesota and their health impacts. Each module is a set of slides scripted with slide notes so you can present them to your own audiences. These training modules are funded in part by a grant for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Following each webinar, we will post the training module on the Minnesota Department of Health website so anyone can access it for future use. Today's webinar will be interactive. We'll be asking 3 polling questions throughout the session that you can respond to using the polling bar that will appear on the right side of your screen. If you have any questions throughout the session, please submit them using the chat function located on the drop-down on the top of your screen. We will be saving 15 minutes to answer questions at the end. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Nissa Tupper. Nissa is a Climate and Health Program Planner at the Minnesota Department of Health, where she works across agencies and disciplines to develop and implement climate and health adaptation strategies. She is also a part of the Minnesota Joint Air and Health Initiative, a collaboration between the Minnesota Department of Health and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. This interagency effort focuses on improving the understanding between air quality and health and engaging communities to reduce health impacts attributable to air pollution. Nissa earned a master's in landscape architecture from the University of Minnesota and is also an experienced public relations professional. Welcome, Nissa.
Thank you, Michaela, and thank you to everyone on the call for listening in today. The focus of today's presentation is on well-being and climate change. While the physical impacts of climate change, such as damage to city infrastructure or disruption in food production, are relatively easy to grasp, the impacts of climate change go well beyond the physical structures and systems around us. Climate change is also significantly impacting human well-being, which is a more intangible and hard to measure consequence. It's just recently receiving focused attention from researchers, policymakers, health professionals, and the like. The content in today's presentation explores climate change through the lens of well-being, starting with an overview of the climate changes we're seeing in Minnesota, how climate change and well-being are connected, and steps that you can walk away with to make a positive impact. Before we get started with the observed climate changes in Minnesota, let's cover a few definitions. Although related, the terms weather and climate are definitely different. Weather generally refers to conditions of the atmosphere over a short period of time, like days or weeks, while climate refers to conditions of the atmosphere over long periods of time, like 20 to 30 years. So when we talk about climate change, we're referring to any significant change in the measures of climate lasting for an extended period of several decades. Weather has always fascinated Minnesotans, perhaps because we have all kinds of it, but recently climate change has also become a leading topic of concern. And here are definitions for climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Actions to prevent the negative health effects of climate change can be described as one or the other. For climate adaptation, this means to anticipate and prepare for the effects of climate change in order to reduce the associated health burdens. Climate mitigation refers to efforts that slow, stabilize, or reverse climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Minnesota Department of Health is dedicated to understanding the links between climate changes and negative health impacts and identifying strategies for addressing these health impacts in our communities. Most climate scientists attribute our changing climate to the burning of fossil fuels, like coal and oil, to produce energy for everyday use. This burning adds heat-trapping gases into the air, like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These heat-trapping gases are commonly known as greenhouse gases. As the graphic on the screen shows, the rise in greenhouse gases is leading to increases in temperature and changes in precipitation. These changes are then disrupting our air quality, weather patterns, water quality and quantity, and ecosystems, which in turn are leading to more air pollution, extreme heat, floods and drought, and ecosystem threats. Many of these changes will have impacts on the health of people, and these impacts will likely increase. One of the main effects of Minnesota's changing climate is that temperatures are rising. Minnesota has gotten noticeably warmer, especially over the last few decades. The slide shows a shift in the rate of change of Minnesota's annual average temperatures. The time frame is from 1895 to 2016, which is approximately the last 120 years. The left side of the graph shows Minnesota temperatures for roughly the first 60 years, from 1895 to 1959, where temperatures increased by about 0.2 of a degree Fahrenheit per decade. The graph on the right side of the slide shows roughly the next 60 years, from 1960 to 2016, where Minnesota's average temperature has accelerated to a rate of over 0.5 degree Fahrenheit per decade. This would amount to an increase of 5 degrees Fahrenheit that we would experience by the end of this century, a significant accelerated rate. Now focus your attention on the red dots. These represent the 10 warmest years in Minnesota. As you can see, 9 of the 10 warmest years in the state recorded since 1895 have occurred in just the last 3 decades. Within this overall annual warming pattern, there have been 3 significant observations in Minnesota. First, winter temperatures are rising twice as fast as the annual average temperatures. We're now experiencing more warmer winter temps, less snow, and more winter rain, and changes in the amount of ice. Secondly, minimum temperatures, which are the overnight lows, have been rising faster than maximum temperatures, which are the daytime highs. In just the last 30 years, average annual overnight lows have been rising at a rate of 6 degrees Fahrenheit per 100-year period. And lastly, the northern part of the state is warming faster than the southern part of the state. Over the last 50 years, there have been a distinct spread of warmer overnight lows in the northern part of Minnesota. And this is consistent with patterns seen across the northern hemisphere, where climate changes are occurring more rapidly at these higher latitudes. Rising temperatures are already causing substantial shifts in the environment. Maps of the plant hardiness zones from the U.S. Department of Agriculture show what types of plants will survive well and where. Zones are based on the average annual minimum winter temperature over a 30-year period, and each zone represents a 10 degree Fahrenheit increment of minimum temperatures. The maps on this slide compare 2 points in recent times. The map on the left is from 1990, and the map on the right is from 2015. Look closely at the changes in Minnesota over this 25-year period. In 1990, Minnesota was predominantly Zone 3 in the northern half of the state and Zone 4 in the southern half of the state. By 2015, these zones shifted north substantially, and in fact, zones historically associated with areas like southern Iowa have now arrived in southern Minnesota. Minnesota is now predominantly Zone 4 across the majority of the state, and Zone 5 has now emerged in the far southern part of our state. The other change that we're observing in Minnesota is a change in our precipitation patterns. With warmer temperatures, more evaporation occurs, and warmer air can hold more water vapor than cooler air. This slide shows Minnesota's average annual precipitation. The time frame is the same as the temperature slides showing the past 120 years from 1895 to 2016. The graph on the left highlights the trend from 1895 to 1959, and the graph on the right highlights the trend from 1960 to 2016. For the first 60 years, the trend in precipitation was actually slightly downward at a loss of 0.2 of an inch per decade. This downward trend was influenced by the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s. The rate of precipitation in the recent 60 years, however, has increased by nearly 0.5 of an inch per decade. Along with the increase in annual average precipitation, the character of precipitation is also changing in Minnesota. The overall increase in our average annual precipitation is being driven by heavy rain events. The graphic on this slide points out that there have been 15 historic mega rain events in Minnesota since 1858, which is when weather record keeping began. It's about 160 years ago. A mega rain event represents a huge amount of rain over a very large geographic area. This is categorized by 6 inches of rainfall covering more than 1,000 square miles, with the core of the rainfall being at least 8 inches. To help visualize the size of this geographic area, 1,000 square miles is the combined size of all of Hennepin, Ramsey, and Washington counties. Over this 160-year period, 7 of these 15 mega rain events have occurred since 2002, just in the last 15 years. And for the first time, we had 2 mega rain events in the same year, one in July 2016 and another in August 2016. Even though there is more moisture in the atmosphere, that doesn't necessarily mean a consistent rise in rain and snow. The changing character of precipitation in Minnesota brings the potential for both extreme wet and extreme dry spells. Increases in heavy rain events have the potential to cause both increased flooding and drought. Based on the localized nature of heavy rain events and their intensity, this can leave some areas of our state drenched and other areas without any precipitation. An example was the year 2012. In that year, 75 of Minnesota's 87 counties were declared disaster areas for drought, as shown on the brown shaded counties on the map. In that same year, 15 counties were declared disaster areas for flooding, and those are the blue shaded counties. For those 15 counties that were declared disasters for flooding, 8 were also declared disasters for drought within that same year, and those are the light blue cross-hatched counties. This underscores the intensification of precipitation extremes in both directions. Next, let's take a look at how these changes in temperature and precipitation impact our health, and in particular, our well-being. While the physical health impacts of these climate hazards, air, weather, water, and ecosystems will be felt everywhere and by everyone, vulnerability to the psychological impacts of these climate hazards will vary across individuals and communities. And that's because a range of factors make individuals and communities more or less vulnerable to experiencing the negative impacts. The framework shown on this and subsequent slides, which was adapted from the 2014 and 2016 climate assessments, will help illustrate the factors that impact vulnerability as it specifically relates to well-being. First, vulnerability to experiencing negative well-being effects from climate hazards may increase the more that individuals or communities are exposed. Exposure specifically encompasses the severity of the climate hazard, along with the frequency and length of exposure to the individual or community experiences. For example, communities that are geographically located in disaster-prone areas, such as those that experience repeated instances of river flooding or drought, could be more vulnerable because they're exposed more often. Second, the individual or community's sensitivity to becoming disrupted by the climate hazard also plays a role in vulnerability. Sensitivity is nuanced and encompasses a number of factors, including the ability to withstand exposure, such as having flood protection measures in place, the environmental and institutional context that positively or negatively impact health outcomes, such as access to mental health services, and lastly, social and behavioral factors, such as having a pre-existing mental health condition, socioeconomic status, family stability, or prior exposure to trauma. Following the diagram logic, you can see that the potential impact as it specifically relates to well-being, as outlined in the green box at left, is jointly produced by the exposure and sensitivity factors that we just discussed. In regards to well-being, potential health outcomes range from minimal stress and distress symptoms to clinical disorders, such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and suicidal thoughts. Other negative well-being impacts include effects on everyday life, perceptions, and social network strains. The good news here is that potential health impacts can be offset by increasing adaptive capacity, which is highlighted in the green box at right. Adaptive capacity refers to the social, behavioral, institutional, and technological responses that are used to lessen the potential impact. In essence, it's our ability to prepare, respond, and build resilience. Considering this full framework of vulnerability allows us to holistically strengthen our capacity to thrive. So what negative health outcomes are people vulnerable to when it comes to well-being and climate change? We'll start by taking a look at the outcomes under the umbrella of distress. Each individual will react differently to climate change based on a variety of personal factors that may include where they live, where they work, the influences of their community and social networks, and any previous significant interactions with their environment, good or bad. Some of the emotional reactions to direct or gradual impacts of climate change can include anxiety, depression, grief, helplessness, and resignation. Because some level of stress is normal during and after disaster, it can be difficult to recognize when an individual is going through normal stress and is capable of coping, or when that person is dealing with something much more serious. However, most people who experience disaster are resilient, and basic support after an event will be sufficient to prevent negative mental health outcomes. As climate change irrevocably impacts traditional landscapes and places where people call home, larger numbers of people are likely to experience the type of stress and negative emotions from a psychological phenomenon called solastalgia. Solastalgia is a newer concept developed to give greater meaning and clarity to environmentally induced distress, and is characterized by a sense of distress or emotional pain felt when the place of solace or homeland is diminished or destroyed. Climate is fundamental to an individual's understanding of place. Places with dramatically changing seasons provide a signal for certain recreational and economic activities, such as the beginning and end of an ice fishing season, planting and harvesting times, and tourism to ski areas. Our attachment to place is what makes environmental changes and disasters particularly distressing. Our ties to places and the environments, traditions, and customs of those places are very deep and are part of our own identity. And that's why we say things like, I'm a Minnesotan, or even, I've lived in Minnesota for 20 years, but I'm a New Yorker at heart. We achieve a sense of belonging within a place through familiarity and attachment to all the characteristics of that place. The impacts of climate change will not have a uniform geographic distribution. Some areas will be more severely and or frequently impacted than others, and thus one's place will be a key determinant of exposure to environmental changes or natural disasters. These impacts of climate change may change the look or feel of defining attributes of our place, including the diminished ability for current native plants and trees to continue to grow, the new ability for invasive species to thrive in areas they once could not, and the loss of habitat for birds and other wildlife. When the ecology of a place changes, it alters our connection to that place, what we know, and our sense of self. In addition to the actual exposure to climate change events, the threat and perception of climate change can also negatively impact a person's level of distress and state of well-being. Even the ongoing exposure to information regarding climate change and its impacts can be a source of negative well-being. For example, mass media messages about climate change and its projected consequences can affect perceptions of physical and societal risks. This stress can also manifest through repeated cumulative exposure to natural disasters, such as annual floods or frequent wildfire. The ongoing uncertainty, anxiety, and dread experienced while anticipating a seasonal or frequent disaster, whether or not that disaster actually happens, can be a significant source of background stress and anxiety. Of particular relevance to Minnesotans are the well-being impacts from drought conditions. Unlike other acute disasters, the onset of drought is difficult to determine, and long-term drought conditions interact over time with multiple environmental, economic, and social stressors to disrupt livelihoods and the functioning of individuals and communities. Rural farming communities in particular are prone to the long-term effects of drought, and drought has been linked to increased incidence of suicide among male farmers. In addition to influencing individual distress, climate change also has the potential to strain relationships, impacting how individuals interact with each other and within their communities. This can impact individual and community well-being in a number of ways, including decreased community cohesion, disrupted sense of continuity and belonging, increased violence and crime, increased social instability, and increased interpersonal aggression and domestic abuse. It's important to note that the relationship impacts from direct climate change events are not only attributable to exposure during the time of the initial event. Impacts likely accelerate the occurrence of additional stressors that can produce strains on relationships. For example, families whose homes are severely damaged or destroyed by flood or wildfire must be relocated before settling permanently. They may have to be separated from their systems of social support. Parents may find themselves less able to be effective caregivers, and family relationships may suffer. This can have implications for interpersonal connections, as the home provides the context for social relationships. Hurricane Katrina has served as a very thorough case study of the lasting mental health impacts of disaster. 7 years after Katrina, many victims are still experiencing stress disorders, some as severe as post-traumatic stress. Populations directly impacted by Hurricane Katrina also have rates of suicide attempt and suicide that are startling. Rates of suicide attempt are 78.6 times higher than pre-Katrina rates, and suicide completion rates are 14.7 times higher. While Katrina serves as a worst-case scenario example, these types of outcomes are not specific to victims of Katrina alone. A 1999 study after the Grand Forks area flood of 1997 in Minnesota found a 24% increase in domestic violence among the affected population.
We will now be having our first polling question. Studies show there is a relationship between changing temperatures and aggression. Which of the following is true? A, rising temperatures increase the potential for increased violence. B, lowering temperatures increase the potential for increased violence. Or C, there is no relationship between temperature and the potential for increased violence. You will now have 30 seconds to submit your response. You'll have a couple more seconds to get your answers submitted. Thank you for answering. The correct answer is A. As temperature rises, so does the potential for increased violence.
While the linkages between climate change and aggression are complex and the evidence is still emerging, one of the consequences most frequently mentioned is the potential for increased violence. Both lab-based and quasi-experiments have demonstrated a relationship between heat and aggression. This could impact healthcare use, direct healthcare costs, and other indirect costs associated with disability, lost productivity, and decrease of quality of life. Moving on to substance abuse, climate change can increase overall stress levels, which can lead to increases in high-risk coping behaviors, such as substance abuse, anxiety disorders, and depression. In general, individuals who use alcohol to cope with stress and those with pre-existing alcohol use disorders are most at risk to increased alcohol use following extreme weather events. Like many other facets of climate change and well-being, this is an emerging issue of concern that could benefit from additional focused research activities. The well-being impacts of climate change can also include serious mental health consequences, including post-traumatic stress disorder, also referenced as PTSD, and anxiety. This especially pertains to extreme weather events, such as floods, wildfires, or prolonged periods of drought that involve loss of life, resources, or disruptions to social or economic networks. PTSD is often linked to higher suicide levels and can increase the likelihood of substance abuse, depression and anxiety, violence and aggression, relationship strain, and job-related difficulties. Individuals who experience multiple acute events, such as more than one natural disaster or multiple years of drought, are likely to experience even more severe trauma and may be even more susceptible to PTSD. The good news is that long-term psychological trauma due to direct or indirect climate change-related exposures is not inevitable. Studies show that a majority of individuals psychologically affected by a traumatic event will recover over time. These individuals likely possess a combination of personal qualities that make post-traumatic growth more likely, including good self-esteem, willingness to problem solve, flexibility, and optimism. Emerging evidence also suggests that individuals who are actively involved in climate change adaptation or mitigation activities experience a well-being benefit. Taking action and becoming involved in the issue both addresses the threat and helps manage the emotional responses as people come to terms with the context of climate change. The well-being impacts of climate change are compounded by risk factors at an individual and community scale. The individual risk factors specific to well-being may include pre-existing mental illness, low socioeconomic status, and lack of resources to afford potential recovery costs, which could include things like home repairs, replacing lost or damaged goods, or loss of employment. Individual risk factors also include low social connectedness and proximity to the disaster. Community risk factors may include outdated emergency plans that do not address mental or behavioral health, and a shortage of mental health and well-being resources available at the time of disaster for both victims and responders. Communities that are particularly vulnerable include disaster-prone areas like river flooding, high wildfire risk, and repeated drought. Community risk factors also include communities that are economically dependent on climate and the environment, such as forestry, fishing, and agriculture.
We will now be having our next polling question. Individual and community factors put some populations more at risk to the well-being impacts of climate change. Which of the following groups are more at risk? Children, women, elderly, persons experiencing homelessness, or all of the above? You will now have 30 seconds to submit your answer. You all did very well on that question. Thanks for answering. The correct answer is E, all of the above. Each of the populations listed are more at risk to the well-being impacts of climate change. Let's learn why. And it looks like those results are just tabulating real quick, and then we will continue on. All right. While we'll all be impacted by climate change to some extent, some populations are more at risk to experiencing negative well-being impacts. And this includes children who are at particular risk for distress and anxiety following an extreme weather event. Children may also be at higher risk than adults of having symptoms that persist in the long term. These symptoms depend on the developmental stage of the child, the level and type of exposure, the amount of destruction seen, and that particular child's risk factors and protective factors. Women can also be more vulnerable, as women have a higher prevalence of PTSD and other mental health disorders after disasters than men, and are also prone to greater worry and feelings of vulnerability and anxiety disorders. Increases in domestic violence toward women are also common after disaster. The elderly are another population of concern, and this is because they tend to have higher rates of untreated depression and physical ailments that contribute to overall vulnerability. Some communities of color, low-income groups, people with limited English proficiency, and some immigrant groups live with many of the factors that contribute to higher risk of poor well-being outcomes due to climate change. Socioeconomic and educational factors, limited transportation, limited access to health education and medical care, and social isolation related to language may impede their ability to prepare for, respond to, and cope with climate-related health risks. A number of health risks are also higher among Indigenous populations, such as poor mental health related to historical or personal trauma. Because of existing vulnerabilities, Indigenous people, especially those who are dependent on the environment for sustenance, are likely to experience greater exposure and lower resilience to climate-related health impacts. People experiencing homelessness are another population of concern. About 30% of people who experience chronic homelessness suffer from some form of mental illness. The majority of people who are experiencing homelessness live in urban and suburban areas where they're more vulnerable to health risks from exposure to heat waves due to the urban heat island effect. The combination of risk factors, including high rates of mental illness and geographic location, contribute to a higher risk of experiencing negative impacts from climate change events like extreme heat. And lastly, the LGBTQ population faces amplified risks to the negative well-being effects of climate change. For example, LGBTQ youth make up 20 to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness.
it can be especially daunting to find and navigate shelters and healthcare systems that provide inclusive and equitable services. Stigmatization, harassment, and abuse are also added trauma that this population can face, which can make coping with the effects of climate change more difficult.
We will now be having our third and final polling question. Certain occupational groups are among the first to be exposed to the effects of climate change. Which of the following occupations fall into this at-risk population? A, farmers, B, fishermen, C, miners, D, forestry workers, or E, all of the above. You will now have 30 seconds to submit your response. Thank you for answering. The correct answer is E, all of the above.
Outdoor workers are often the first to be exposed to the effects of climate change. As highlighted in the polling question, this includes farmers and other agricultural workers, fishermen, and those in construction, forestry, and mining. As previously mentioned, occupations impacted by drought are a particular concern because while some people may initially be resilient to the impacts, drought conditions over time can lead to significant psychological distress. Emergency workers and first responders, including healthcare workers and public safety workers, are also at increased risk for mental health consequences from climate change, both in the short and long term. The very nature of the work, which involves being exposed to a traumatic event and helping others in crisis, frequently working long hours in difficult environments, and being away from loved ones, increases the susceptibility of first responders and emergency workers to experiencing negative mental health consequences. In general, some uncertainty remains about the degree to which future extreme weather and climate events will impact mental health and well-being. An increase in scope, frequency, and severity of these events will increase the number of people impacted and the degree to which they're affected. However, efforts that effectively increase preparation for both the physical and psychological consequences of extreme weather and climate-related events could decrease the impact on mental health and well-being. So where do we go from here? We'd like to share 6 meaningful action steps that public health professionals can take. Public health plays a critical role in protecting the health of Minnesotans. Our first call to action is to examine planning processes and response activities to find opportunities where we can integrate mental health and well-being supports. For example, this could include incorporating mental and behavioral health considerations into local all hazards plans. This could include first, identifying lead and supporting agencies that can help assess and provide mental and behavioral care. Second, documenting mental and behavioral resources. And third, identifying support processes and resources for first responders. Beyond the local all hazards plan, it's important that we help guide the rapid restoration of key support systems to help reduce the number of traumatic stress reactions. Successfully reinstating systems of safety and security, family reunification, foundations for returning to work, and institutions that provide meaning, such as school, church, and civic organizations, also allows the population to begin the recovery process with social support. One preparation that might appear small but could make a big impact is encouraging residents to incorporate mental health items into their disaster preparedness kits. This could include comfort items like pictures, small toys for children, favorite treats, or recreational items like books and games. The second call to action is to learn more to help more. Public health departments can increase their effectiveness in preventing long-term traumatic stress reactions by becoming more informed as professionals, in particular, getting trained in psychological and mental health first aid. Psychological first aid can be used in any trauma setting and can be practiced by almost any person. It helps create and sustain an environment of safety, calm and comfort, connectedness, self-empowerment, and hope. Mental health first aid training can help generate an understanding of mental illness and intervention strategies. Mental health first aid demystifies mental illness and builds the capacity to obtain, process, and understand the health information and services needed to make appropriate decisions and seek care. At a systems level, public health professionals should be part of building community-level networks to create the resilience necessary for communities to successfully prepare for and cope with the potential psychological impacts of climate change. Scholars agree that climate preparedness planning is most likely to succeed if the community is involved. However, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, professionals should work collectively to help communities prepare. At a tactical response level, public health departments are not expected to provide a full range of mental and behavioral health treatment, but they should be organized and equipped to serve as a bridge between residents in need and local mental and behavioral health treatment providers. Having a good understanding of the mental health resources available in your community will help provide follow-up and long-term care to those who need it. It's important to discuss disaster behavioral health roles and responsibilities with specific providers before a disaster if you plan on referring trauma victims. Many psychological stress symptoms stem from the early phases of a disaster, and this brings us to our fourth call to action: communicate with intention. When people are in the throes of extreme distress and emotion, it's crucial that the services available to them are sensitive, intentional, and interactional. Public health professionals can help limit the long-term negative psychological consequences and trauma of acute events by promoting a sense of safety, calm, collective efficacy, connectedness, and hope. Outside of disaster events, public health can also reduce worry and anxiety by communicating about climate change strategically. Often, well-meaning attempts to create urgency about climate change rely on our appeals to fear of disasters or uncertainty. Unfortunately, this type of discussion can leave people feeling overwhelmed and powerless. Instead, public health has the opportunity to share the anticipated health impacts of climate change and then follow with meaningful strategies for coping with those impacts. One way to reduce the feelings of powerlessness is to talk about climate action at a local level, which appeals to our sense of place. This removes some of the abstraction and fear associated with things we can't understand, and it also allows us to focus on actions that can have an impact on our immediate communities. Public health can also play an important role in helping advocate for a system of recovery and resilience by promoting the positive mental health impacts of taking climate action. Emerging evidence shows that individuals who are actively involved in climate change adaptation or mitigation activities experience appreciable health and well-being benefits. Public health can play two roles in supporting that system of resilience. The first role is to support climate mitigation efforts, which means taking on or supporting efforts that slow, stabilize, or reverse climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The second is to support our communities with adapting to climate change, anticipating and preparing for the effects of climate change, and reducing the negative health outcomes. This presents an opportunity for us to examine the role that we can play in the systems that support our well-being and to model behavior in regards to mitigation. Encouraging activities that provide a sense of personal meaning and satisfaction, such as promoting the positive health benefits of climate action like biking as a mode of transportation or choosing clean energy to reduce air quality impacts. Last, but certainly not least, we should focus on equity in all that we do in the face of climate change and health. As discussed earlier, not everyone will experience climate change in the same way, and this should be taken into account when developing programs and protocols that address climate and health impacts. Taking a health equity approach means matching resources and supports against need to facilitate the best outcome for all. And this is not to be confused with equality, which treats everyone the same regardless of their starting point. To truly address health equity through the lens of climate change and well-being, we can't leave anyone behind. We need to actively shape our structures and systems of care with the aim of granting fair and just access by distributing resources according to areas and populations that may be more susceptible to negative impacts. To learn more in general about mental health and well-being in Minnesota, the MDH Mental Health Promotion Program offers information and resources to help guide investments in mental health promotion and illness prevention. Specific to our discussion today of climate change and well-being is the program's monthly learning community. The program leads a monthly learning community for anyone interested in building resilience and promoting mental well-being. The learning community is held the last Tuesday of each month from 10 a.m. to noon and emphasizes community-based initiatives. To find out more about the learning community or the MDH Mental Health Promotion Program, you can visit the link shown at the bottom of the slide or search for mental health through the MDH agency website. In summary, Minnesota's climate is changing. We're seeing an increase in temperature and changes in levels of precipitation. Climate change is significantly impacting human well-being, which is often a more intangible and hard to measure consequence. Potential well-being impacts are jointly produced by exposure and sensitivity factors. Impacts range from minimal stress and distress symptoms to clinical disorders like anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Some populations are more at risk to experiencing negative well-being impacts. And for example, this could include children, women, the elderly, some communities of color, Indigenous populations, people experiencing homelessness, and workers employed in outdoor occupations. It's important to remember that the potential negative well-being impacts can be offset by increasing adaptive capacity. And as just shown, there are several actions we can take as professionals and individuals to help build our resilience. So in closing, I'd like to thank the following people who contributed their time and insights to this training module. That includes Nancy Carlson, Dominique Jones, Anna Lynn, Christy Manning, Lorena Pierce, Nellie Turori, and Catherine Zimmer. They each brought perspectives and expertise to the table over the course of several months to shape what you saw today, and it's a great example of professionals working outside of their traditional scope to advance public health. So my thanks to this group. And with that, we're now at the end of our presentation. So thank you to everyone on the phone for attending the webinar today. We hope you found this presentation useful, and I believe we now have time for a few questions.